Hello, welcome to Rockcastle Storytime. Today we're in the library. Today we're going to do a little something different. We're going to read from this book called More Offbeat Kentuckians by Kevin McQueen. There's another book that comes before this one that's really good too, and it's just strange stories about Kentuckians. This one is called Big Harpe and Little Harpe, Frontier Thugs. And they are about some people and things that happen right here in Rockcastle County. Life was so hard for Kentucky pioneers, and the perils of those times are so ingrained in our consciousness that it is difficult to disassociate the pioneers with the hardships they faced. And what a comprehensive litany of misery it was. Ferocious wild animals, unending physical labor, malnutrition, lack of medical supplies, and of course, the constant fear of being attacked by Indians who failed to see the humor in being gradually pushed off their land. We modern folk, nestled in our warm, well-stocked homes and surrounded by conveniences, are far removed from the harsh life endured by our ancestors. We need not worry too extensively about wild animals, excessive work, starvation, gangrene, or being tomahawked as we inspect the cucumbers in the garden. Yet the possibility remains of someone else deciding to shorten our days. This is a bond we share with our ancestors. We also live with fear of being murdered. And it is a justifiable worry. Of course, we are more likely to be killed by a greedy relative or disgruntled acquaintance than by a vengeful Indian. But that is hardly a comforting thought. There was one very real and terrifying peril from Kentucky's early times that now seldom receives much attention. We all know about Indian attacks, but the pioneers also had to be wary of each other. It wasn't long after the Wilderness Trail became widely traveled that ne'er-do-wells realized it was easier to rob others than to work for a living. Soon the forest was full of highway robbers and cutthroats looking for easy prey. Of all the professional thugs who prowled the wilderness, none evoked such terror as the Harpe brothers. There were two Harpes, though one was more than enough. And originally they were from North Carolina. The elder was Micajah, born in 1768, and the younger was Wiley, born in 1770. They were better known to their contemporaries as Big Harpe and Little Harpe, respectively. Their father allegedly had been a Tory soldier during the Revolutionary War. That is, he sided with King George III rather than the American colonists. Some have theorized that the family may have been treated as contemptible traitors by neighbors, a common fate of British sympathizers, and that any rough treatment the Harpe family received may have fueled the brothers' contempt for humanity. As adults, the brothers were not just garden variety highway robbers. If anything, they are reminiscent of latter-day serial killers. Though unlike most serial killers, there was occasionally some monetary incentive in the brothers' crimes. The story of the Harpes, remarked their biographer, Otto Rothroth, is more than of mere criminals. They were arch criminals, apparently loving murder for its own sake. Remarkably, most of the Harpes' mayhem was accomplished in only the 2 years spanning 1798 to 1799. The brothers' legendary criminal career officially began in 1795 when they traveled to Beaver Creek near Knoxville, Tennessee. Soon afterwards, Little Harpe married Sally Rice, a preacher's daughter. This was not quite a coup, yet it did not compare with the matrimonial adventures of Big Harpe, who had arrived with two wives named Susan and Betsy Roberts in tow. Bigamy was the least of his crimes against man and God, for he and Little Harpe soon demonstrated to the community their proficiency in the fine arts of gambling, fixed horse races, stealing livestock, and arson. They also became masters at avoiding jail time, despite having been arrested numerous times. At length, the lively villains felt it wise to desert Tennessee. Before leaving the territory, they committed their first known homicide. The victim was named Johnson, and the motive remains a mystery. After the murder, the Harpes performed a method of corpse disposal favored by river pirates, cutting open Johnson's abdomen, removing the intestines, filling the cavity with rocks, and tossing the body into the Holstein River. Whew. For all their trouble, within a few days Johnson's body surfaced for all to behold. From Tennessee, the Harpes made their way to Kentucky's Wilderness Road. In December 1798, they stopped at John Ferris's Tavern in Crab Orchard, Lincoln County. In case you are wondering, the county was named for General Benjamin Lincoln, not Abraham, whose birth was still a decade and some change away. Stephen Langford, a lone Virginian, took up with them. When the Harpes left for the wilderness, Langford accompanied them, feeling it was safer to travel in numbers. His folly was established on December 14th, when cattle drivers found Langford's body crudely hidden behind a log. It did not require an excess of gray matter to figure out that the guilty parties were the Harpes, the last persons Langford was known to travel with, and the manhunt commenced. A few days later, they were captured, as far as I know without incident, and imprisoned at Stanford. The two Harpes and their collective 3 wives appeared in the Lincoln County Court of Quarter Sessions on January the 4th, 1799, and after it was decided there were probable grounds to try them for murder, the case was transferred to the District Court in Danville on January 5th, 1799. The Harpes and their pregnant wives were taken to the Danville jail, pending their trial scheduled for April. The Harpes had gained a reputation in Tennessee for escaping from prisons. It appears the jailer at Danville had heard about this, for his expense account shows that on January 20th he purchased a bolt and 2 horse locks to chain the men's feet to the ground. He must have felt this was not protection enough. On February 13th, he procured a new lock for the jail's front door. This still deemed insufficient, for on February 27th, he brought 3 pounds of nails, evidently to reinforce the jail's structure. Despite these precautions, the Harpes somehow managed to break out on March 16th, leaving their 3 wives and 3 infants, all born in jail, to fend for themselves. The jailer's expense account book notes that he spent 12 shillings mending the walls of the jail where the prisoners escaped. The trio of Mrs. Harpes was tried for murder starting April 15th. After a trial lasting 5 days, they were all acquitted. They proclaimed to the court that they were glad to be shed of their brutish husbands and wanted nothing more than to go home to Knoxville with their infants and put the whole ordeal behind them. The generous citizens of Danville, feeling their heartstrings tugged, donated clothes, money, and a horse to the women. The jailer escorted them on the road to Knoxville. The women left, no doubt tearfully thanking their benefactors. Then about 30 miles down the road, they shifted their course and instead traveled to Henderson, Kentucky, where they rejoined their husbands as planned before the Harpes jailbreak. On April 22nd, the governor issued a reward for the capture of the Harpes. As if in retaliation, the brothers undertook a harvest of homicides that made their previous dark deeds seem like tea party pleasantries. Travelers and wayfarers began disappearing at an alarming rate, and many were never seen again. The Harpes' movements could be traced by the locations of the murders. The pattern moved from Kentucky to southern Illinois, then to East Tennessee, then back to Kentucky. It has been estimated that they committed a minimum of 20 murders within a year. They killed the small son of Colonel Trabeau in Adair County just because it seemed like the thing to do at the time. In western Kentucky, the Harpes got their work in on 3 men named Dooley, Gilmore, and Hudgen. Sometimes the brothers passed themselves off as Methodist ministers, robbing and killing people after divine services. Their bloodlust may not have been confined only to strangers. Legend holds that Big Harpe, annoyed by the crying of Little Harpe's baby and convinced that the child's cries would lead to their capture, swung the child by the feet and dashed its brains out against a tree, just as the Indians did to Jenny Wiley's baby in a different chapter in Kentucky history. On August 20th, 1799, the Harpe's brothers were traveling alone. They stopped to rest at the cabin of Moses Stegall, located 5 miles east of what is now Dixon. Stegall was not at home, but his wife invited the two men to stay overnight. Major William Love, a surveyor who desired to see Mr. Stegall on business, already occupied the spare bed in the loft, but he offered to share it with the two strangers. Late that night, one of the brothers killed Love by means of a single blow to the head with an axe, allegedly on the grounds that he objected to the major's snoring. To cap the atrocity, the Harpes killed Mrs. Stegall and slit the throat of her 4-month-old son. Then they set the cabin on fire and made themselves scarce. This triple murder proved to be the Harpes' undoing. Moses Stegall was a man of action, and when he learned the next day of his family's fate, he and Squire Silas McBee immediately formed a heavy armed posse. The men set out in pursuit of the killers and were rewarded the next morning when they spotted the Harpes at a distance. Even better, the fugitives had only one horse. When the brothers realized they were being pursued, Big Harpe mounted the horse with a fine disregard for his sibling and rode away. Little Harpe fled on foot on the opposite direction, and thus they managed to evade the posse. The vigilantes did not find the Harpes, but they did find the outlaws' camp, and therein the wife of Little Harpe. She claimed that they had just missed Big Harpe, who rode into the camp and frantically left with his 2 wives and an extra horse. One member of the posse stood guard over Mrs. Little Harpe as the others took off in hot pursuit. They soon caught up with Big Harpe. He rode away at a full gallop, abandoning the 2 Mrs. Big Harpes, just as he had his brother and sister-in-law. The pursuers fired at the killer. At last, one shot hit home, and Big Harpe fell off his horse. The mortally wounded desperado asked for a drink of water, which was brought to him, using his own boot in place of a cup. Despite this act of mercy, when Moses Stegall walked up, the fallen Harpe knew better than to expect an affectionate interchange of tender expression of regard. Otto Rothrock describes what happened next. While reciting to Big Harpe how brutally he had murdered his wife and child, Stegall drew a knife, declaring he would cut off his enemy's head. Then he pointed a gun at Harpe's face. The dying outlaw, conscious of the threat, jerked his head from side to side, hoping to dodge the threatened bullet. "Very well," said Stegall. "I will not shoot you in the head, for I want to save it as a trophy." Then, aiming at his heart, he shot him in the left side. That was the ignominious end of one of the most dreaded men who ever terrorized the frontier. Stegall's threat was not an idle one. He beheaded Harpe and left the rest of his body for the buzzards and wild animals to enjoy. The site of this bloody but richly deserved deed is in present-day Muhlenberg County, and it is known as Harpe's Hill. The entire company, the 7 members of the posse, the 3 Harpe women, and the head of Big Harpe, nestled in a sack, all rode 35 miles back to Dixon. Once home, Moses Stegall chose to make an example of Harpe. Taking a hint from medieval history, he stuck the head of his late foe on a pole. He displayed it as a warning to all outlaws at the crossroad, marked by a huge white oak tree 3 miles north of Dixon, near where the Harpes had murdered Steggall's family and Major Love. The community still bears the proud name of Harpe's Head. There remained the matter of finding Little Harpe. This was no easy task, for he had sense enough to get as far from the region as possible. It was not until 1803 that he resurfaced with the shiny new name John Seton, as a member of Sam Mason's infamous pack of river pirates who terrorized the Mississippi River. In January 1803, the entire gang was captured at New Madrid, Missouri, but escaped before they could be tried. It must have provoked feelings of deja vu in Little Harpe, especially when the gang found itself on the run from another posse. No one, not even Mason himself, was aware of Seton's true identity. Soon afterwards, 2 men came to Greenville, Missouri, toting the head of Sam Mason in a sack and demanding the $1,000 reward that had been offered by the state's governor. Those pitiable souls who labor under the impression that history is boring are unaware of the endless parade of heads and sacks that the subject offers. Several persons who had known Mason examined the head and declared that it was indubitably authentic, if somewhat gamey. The 2 men who claimed the reward said their names were James May and John Seton. If the pursuit, death, and decapitation of Harpe had not been a peculiarly cinematic moment in American history, what followed next was no less. Just as the judge was making out an official certificate so May and Seton could claim their prize, a stranger stepped into the courtroom and stopped the proceedings. He had just come from the local tavern, he said, and realized he had previously seen 2 of the horses in the stable. A couple of months before, on the Natchez Trace Road, 2 men had robbed him and murdered an acquaintance, had ridden identical horses. When the stranger got a good look at May and Seton, who by this point must have been wishing they were somewhere else, he recognized them as his attackers. Instead of getting their expected $1,000 reward, the 2 men were hustled off to Greenville jail. Rumor quickly spread that John Seton was actually Little Harpe, a Kentuckian who had seen Little Harpe while the outlaw had been imprisoned at Danville, visited the jail, and made a positive identification. Other jailhouse visitors described a scar, a mole, and a birth defect known to be identifying marks of Little Harpe, and the prisoner matched their descriptions in every particular. That effectively ended the John Seton business. In yet another moment of deja vu, Harpe and May escaped from jail. They were summarily recaptured, went to trial, and found guilty on January 13, 1804. The judge ordered that the death sentence be carried out on February 4th. Some sources say February 8th. We may attribute the executions following so quickly on the heels of the sentencing to the fact that justice moved more swiftly then, or perhaps the community simply wanted to be shed of the remaining Harpe as quickly as possible. The criminals were hanged at Gallows Field on the recommended date. After their deaths, an unsatisfied mob decapitated both bodies and placed the heads on poles, one on each end of town, as a no-nonsense deterrent to other criminals. In the case of the Harpe brothers, history does not merely repeat itself, it stutters. Harpe's and May's bodies, bereft of their heads, were dumped together in a single grave near the old Natchez Trace Road. With the passage of time, the road was widened and worn deep. Gradually, the 2 criminal skeletons were unearthed by the ceaseless tramping of foot and hoof, and were feasted upon by the less discriminating dogs. Thus, the last vestige of Little Harpe disappeared on the very highway upon which he had committed many crimes, writes Robert Rothra of this ghoulish irony. Whatever happened to the plethora of Harpe wives, you may be wondering? After Big Harpe's colorful demise, the 3 captured women were taken to jail at Henderson, Kentucky, and tried on September 4, 1799. They were found guilty of having been accessories to murder and were sent to the Logan District Court in Russellville. But in October, that court found the women not guilty, apparently for no other reason than the public sympathy demanded such a verdict. Once again, popular sentiment had saved the women from a jail sentence or worse. But the Mrs. Harpes learned their lesson the second time around. Little Harpe's wife moved back to Tennessee, and Big Harpe's 2 widows and 2 children stayed in Logan County, where they appeared to have stayed out of trouble for the rest of their lives. The reader will remember the pleasing image of Big Harpe's head perched on a pole before a white oak tree at the Dixon Crossroads. At some point, a creative person sharpened a branch on a tree and stuck the head on that. It remained there for years, serving as a memento mori for the criminally inclined and scaring the wits out of village children. Somebody, possibly the same artiste who stuck the head on the tree, shinnied up the trunk, and carved a portrait of Harpe underneath the skull. The likeness remains long after the cranium itself crumbled into fragments. Around 1887, lightning struck the tree and denuded it of all of its branches. In 1891, lightning hit the beleaguered tree again, setting it aflame and leaving nothing but a bare and blackened 30-foot trunk. But the carved face remained visible, spooking all who passed by it. As a closing irony, some have credited the antisocial deeds of the Harpes and other frontier outlaws with benefiting civilization in the long run. As Otto Rothrod explains, dread of highwaymen brought peaceful frontiersmen together and thus built up communities and helped to hasten the establishment of law and order. Moses Stegel probably would have found that cold comfort. Until next time.